our naval bases to the hurricanes that disable our airfields. The list is long. There are many ways climate change affects our security. So second, we must adapt, providing our armed forces with the equipment they need to operate in extreme heat and extreme cold, training them to assist in disaster relief, reinforcing our coastal facilities against rising water levels, and addressing the security implications of more economic and military activity in the high north. We have identified the initial steps in our adaptation. We now take account of climate change when planning our operations and our missions, and when developing new capabilities. This way, we make sure we remain effective in increasingly harsh environments. And third, we must reduce the impact of our military activities on the climate. We cannot compromise our military effectiveness. NATO is about preserving peace through a credible deterrence and defense. Nothing is more important. If we fail to preserve peace, we will also fail to fight climate change. At the same time, we also have a responsibility to reduce emissions. To this end, we have developed the first methodology for measuring NATO's greenhouse gas emissions, civilian and military. It sets out what to count and how to count it. And it will be made available to all allies to help them reduce their own military emissions. This is vital because what gets measured can get cut. Based on this new methodology, I can announce today the first emission targets for NATO as an organization. By 2030, we will reduce emissions by at least 45%, reducing to net zero by 2050. We have conducted thorough analysis of how to do this. It will not be easy, but it can be done. A big part of this will be our transition away from fossil fuels. All allies are committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions as part of the Paris Agreement. Adapting their militaries will contribute to this, including more green tech such as renewables, climate-friendly synthetic fuels, and more energy-efficient solutions. There is a technological revolution happening right now, a green energy revolution, one that can be of huge benefit for our militaries. Already today, the best new cars are actual electric cars. And I believe that in the future, the most advanced military vehicles and the most resilient armed forces will be those that do not rely on fossil fuels. By making our equipment more efficient and by taking full advantage of new technologies, we can improve our militaries and strengthen our security, as well as help tackle climate change. It will also increase our resilience. The war in Ukraine shows the danger of being too dependent on commodities from authoritarian regimes. The way Russia is using energy as a weapon of coercion highlights the need to quickly wean off Russian oil and gas. At the same time, we must not swap one dependency for another. Lots of new green technologies and the rare earth minerals they require come from China. So we must diversify our energy sources and our suppliers. Another risk is creating a patchwork of incompatible systems. where all 30 NATO allies follow their own separate path towards energy security and adoption of new technologies. This would present serious risks to our interoperability. Instead, we should work together to ensure that national policies enhance our collective military strength, and NATO is the ideal platform for allies to coordinate our efforts. By setting shared benchmarks and standards, we can innovate together while maintaining our operational effectiveness. So therefore, I will ask NATO civilian and military authorities to develop a new energy transition by design initiative and present it at the next high-level dialogue meeting next year. These high-level meetings will be held annually, establishing NATO as a nexus between climate and security. Climate change is not a threat that exists far beyond the horizon or long into the future. We see its impact on our security right now. We now have a plan with concrete actions to address the security risks of climate change, to ensure our alliance adapts to the new challenges, and to protect NATO's 1 billion citizens. Thank you so much.
Secretary General, once again, welcome, and thank you so much for those remarks. It's fantastic to be here with you all today. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am the senior correspondent for CNBC News, covering politics and energy markets and how often they come together. Secretary General, in those remarks, essentially you were saying that energy security equals national security. It's a conversation that we've been having again and again, the two of us, for a long time now, even prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And you mentioned that working together between NATO allies is essential in terms of tackling climate change and in terms of coordinating efforts. I want to float something with you. Over the last several days, we've heard the idea of an oil cap floated amongst G7 members, what that might look like. When you think about that a little bit more broadly, could NATO lead that conversation? Because essentially you've got to negotiate with the rest of the world here. And a lot of the rest of the world blames the West and blames NATO for inflation, high energy prices, and the idea that we could at some point in the near future be talking about a food scarcity problem that could eventually lead to famine. So in terms of that oil cap, how do you think that that's actually going to get done, and will NATO lead the way?
So first of all, I think that you now mentioned many challenges, and we have to understand that all of those challenges are related to the war in Ukraine, which is a brutal war of aggression by President Putin against the independent sovereign nation in Europe. The reason for the consequences which impact global energy markets, global food markets, the responsibility for that is President Putin. You have to understand that it's not the easiest way to end all these problems is just to end the war and for President Putin to withdraw his forces and end attacking a sovereign independent nation. Then I think we also have to remember that the reason why we have the challenges with, for instance, food prices and the problems of getting grain out to Ukraine is not because of our economic sanctions. There are no sanctions from NATO allies against exports of grain. So the reason why it's hard to get grain out of Ukraine, food out of Ukraine, is the war, is the Russian blockade. Then I, of course, recognize that our economic sanctions, for instance, on parts of Russian industry, on the financial sectors, also have global ramification, also for the energy markets. And therefore Europeans, NATO allies, the United States partners, they pay a price. There is no way to deny that. But that price is much lower than the price we will pay if Putin gets his way by using military force against an independent nation. It's about the price we have to pay for freedom, for upholding a rules-based international order, and ensure that the lesson President Putin learns from this war is that he will be rewarded by using this kind of brutal military force. So I'm not in any way suggesting that there is zero consequences for us economically as a NATO allies and partners by the sanctions we are imposing on Russia, but I'm saying that the most severe are direct consequences of the war itself, grain, and second, that the fact that we are paying a price is actually a price is worth paying to support the brave Ukrainian people in upholding the right for self-defense. Then on that specific issue of oil cap, well, the message from this high-level meeting and also in the assessment I delivered today was to look at the direct link between military activities, climate change and our security. And therefore, NATO will not be the forum to address something which is more directly related to the economic consequences of higher oil prices. So I would leave it to and I think it's also good that the G7 and all the allies are engaging in those issues. We will focus on climate change and of course all the other core tasks of NATO, but the discussions on how to, what should I say, deal with the high energy prices, I think there are other platforms that are more suited for that than NATO.
Secretary General, just as a follow-on to that, you mentioned in your comments authoritarian regimes. Were you referring to China, Russia, and perhaps OPEC members like Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
So I referred to the fact that I have always believed in free trade. I still believe in free trade. I think that free trade actually fuels prosperity, growth. It's good for our economies, and division of labor has been key for economic development over centuries. At the same time, I think we need to realize that too heavy dependence on some specific commodities can create vulnerabilities for our free and open societies. And therefore, it's not as if free trade always promotes freedom. Actually, sometimes we have to be careful. And one example is too heavy dependence on gas from Russia. That was not obvious for everyone before Ukraine, but now it's obvious for everyone that the high dependence by European allies on imports of gas from Russia has made them vulnerable in a way they should never have been in the situation we are now with the brutal invasion of Ukraine. Second, I also believe that, of course, we should trade with China. China is the biggest, soon the biggest economy in the world. Trade with China has been important for many of our companies for prosperity, will be it also in the future. But we have to be aware of the same risks of too heavy dependence, for instance, on some rare earth minerals, which are key for many different technologies, including green technologies. We have to be aware of the risk of China controlling critical infrastructure. Not so many years ago, 2-3 years ago, it was a big discussion whether we should be concerned about Chinese control of 5G networks. Now I think everyone realizes that that is something that matters for our security. So we should not, in a way, in the shadow of the idea of free trade, open up and make our infrastructure vulnerable to Chinese control when we, for instance, speak about 5G networks. And then lastly, we should also realize the danger of too much what I would call naive free trade, if that leads to that we are sharing key technologies we are developing with authoritarian powers. So I'm not against trading with authoritarian countries. That will be the case, has been and will be the case in the future. But we need to be aware of the risks, the vulnerabilities, and therefore the work we now do in NATO to improve resilience, to increase awareness of these issues, and then in dialogue with allies in different ways, also ensure that we continue to be in favor of free trade, but we also have to have some limits and some guidelines on how to not create new vulnerabilities, as we have seen, for instance, with too high dependence on imports of Russian gas.
Secretary General, when you think about this within the context of the current situation with regards to climate change and the energy transition, I just want to read you a couple of comments that we've heard in recent days, as quoted to CNBC. The CEO of Exxon discussing the current energy situation and saying that society is going to pay a very high price if governments and industries abandon fossil fuels too soon. The CEO of BP essentially saying that the world needs to back those who deliver the energy that the world needs today as well as tomorrow. When you think about that within the context of where we are now, there is deep concern that consumers across the West and elsewhere are going to basically face a cost of living crisis in the coming months as a direct result of the situation that we're seeing today in Ukraine. What is your message to the oil and gas community at this point? Are you willing, as NATO allies, to work with them through this transition? Should we be investing more money now in not just renewables, but also fossil fuels today?
So first of all, many NATO allies are, of course, working very closely with the industry, also the energy industry, and also those parts of the energy industry that are investing in fossil fuels. And what we see is that many of these companies, they're actually now also key in the transition away from fossil fuels. So I think a lot of the technology, the capital, the competence these companies have will be key for the transition away from fossil fuel.
So demonizing them isn't the way forward?
No, that's never the answer. But because the issue is that the question is not whether we have to move away from fossil fuels. There's no way we can achieve the goals we have set to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases either by moving away from fossil fuels and or by developing technologies for carbon capture. And I think we have to do both. Then, of course, the high prices we see now, they are a big problem for ordinary households throughout the world. And again, poor people are more vulnerable than rich people because they are more able to pay for higher energy prices. Those who don't have so much, for them this is really, really a serious problem. I think the answer is to increase supply. And of course, what we have seen is that the high prices on oil and gas and also the cut in supply has to some extent led to that some countries are moving back to coal. That is bad for climate, but of course it reflects the desperate situation they are in. Hopefully, and I think that also will happen and is happening, and that is that increased prices on oil and gas will also then incentivize investments in also more energy efficient solutions, because you can reduce emissions just by finding more energy efficient solutions, even though you continue to use different types of fossil fuels, by investing in new types of energy, everything from biofuels to clean scientific fuels to also hydrogen and other green and clean energy sources. And then I am a man that believes in the idea of carbon capture. We have seen several big projects, and I think that with increasing carbon prices and increasing awareness of the need to reduce carbon emissions, there will be big carbon capture projects that will help us to provide both energy and reduce emissions at the same time.
You mentioned the backlash there. It's something that the UN Secretary General has also talked about, the risk of backlash because of the higher living costs. Essentially, power prices could take 3 to 5 years to fall back to lower levels, according to the CEO of Germany's largest power producer. There's a lot of speculation at this point about at a time in the near future, potentially as we move into the winter months, that you're going to lose the support of the public. What is NATO's strategy to ensure that that doesn't happen?
To convey how important this fight is, and to convey how important it is that we support Ukraine. Of course, there is no way to deny that we pay a price, as I said. But you have to remember that by far the highest price is paid by the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. They're actually fighting every day. We see casualties, we see attacks on cities, on civilian infrastructure, on hospitals, on schools. So of course, I recognize that also people in NATO allied countries and partners see the consequences of the war because of higher energy prices, and I share those concerns, and as political leaders throughout the alliance, they are addressing that in different ways. But that's a very different situation than the situation people experiences in Ukraine, where they actually are killed and where we see atrocities and where people are afraid of their lives. So we have to put things in perspective. Second, and this is about a kind of moral and political obligation to Ukraine. But second, it is in our interest to support Ukraine. We support Ukraine partly because they are a close partner. We have worked with them for many years, but also because it will be our world. The world of NATO allies will be more insecure if Putin wins this war. So it's in our security interest to make sure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, and therefore we need to provide support as long as it takes, and the option has a much higher price than to pay price now to ensure that Ukraine prevails.
Secretary General, walk us through how this looks from a hardware perspective. Are we going to see electric F-35s? I mean, where are we today in those types of prototypes?
Also, I'm very careful predicting exactly what kind of electric vehicles or whatever. It may be not electric, it may be hydrogen, there may be fuel cells. There are different types of energy solutions. I will not be specific exactly on what will be the winning technology. What we see now, at least when it comes to vehicles, cars, is that electric is really on the offensive. It may be other technologies for more heavy vehicles, for instance, hydrogen. The experts have different views. I think the most important we can do is to support research, development, and price emissions. Because if we support the development of new technologies, if we put the price on carbon emission, it will become profitable to develop clean technologies. And then actually we'll leave to the industry to innovate and to find out exactly what is the best solution to the specific task, either to move big battleships or to move small cars or whatever that is. That's not for politicians, but that's for the industry to decide and then offer those solutions to the military. What I'm absolutely certain about is that if there is a technological revolution taking place in the civilian sector, which is now the case, with less and less dependence on fossil fuels and more new green technologies for all energy solutions in the civilian sector, from electric cars to carbon capture to fuel cells to hydrogen in the civilian sector, it will not be good for the military if we end up as the only fossil fuel sector left in the world some decades from now. That will weaken our military capabilities. So if we want to maintain the technological edge and have the best cars, the best planes, the best technologies, then we need to be green, not only because we care about climate change, but because we care about having the best technologies in our armed forces. So in the short run, there may be a contradiction between green and military effectiveness. In the long run, green and military effectiveness is the same.
Secretary General, we only have a few minutes left, and I have to ask you one of the burning questions ahead of the next couple of days, and that, of course, is Sweden and Finland and their joining the alliance. Where are we today with that question?
The decisions by Finland and Sweden to apply for membership, they are historic, and that will strengthen the security of Finland and Sweden, of NATO, and be important for the whole transatlantic alliance. At the same time, we need to ensure that when new allies or new countries join the alliance, we have to take into account the security interests of all allies. And Turkey has expressed some serious concerns on issues like terrorism. And we all know that no NATO ally has suffered more terrorist attacks than Turkey. Thousands of people have been killed, and PKK and other groups, they are responsible for these terrorist attacks, and PKK is a terrorist organization. That is something which is also not only many NATO allies proscribe PKK as a terrorist organization, but the European Union, Finland and Sweden. So of course, to sit down then and discuss with Turkey how can we step up, do more together, in fighting terrorism, which is a threat to our security, is an issue that is absolutely legitimate and important as part of the accession process we now and dialogue we now have with Finland and Sweden. I will not, promise anything. I can only tell you that I have spoken several times with President Erdogan, with the Finnish and the Finnish president and with the Swedish prime minister. We will meet later on today. President Erdogan President Niinistö and Prime Minister Andersson, and I hope that we can make some progress, but let's meet first and then I can update you afterwards.
Secretary General.
Standing orders, and that we continue to hear the statement without interruptions. Thank you.
Presiding Officer, the path I have laid out today is about bringing clarity and certainty to this debate.